seemed to be ignoring were the objections by Mr. Bregman to facts not in evidence.
Okay.
And he repeated the statement that was not in evidence, and I told him not to do it. I don't want to discuss it any further.
Okay, well, that's the one that those are the other two that I did not understand, Judge.
I don't follow how you can't understand that.
Well, the question that I asked was about him laying on the ground, and that was the objection to facts not in evidence. And I think that is something that is an interpretation from the video, and that is the state's position that he was laying on the ground.
That's for the jury to determine.
Okay, so that's why I wanted to say you don't want me to ask any questions that start with him laying on the ground. That you think that is a fact not in evidence. Because that was the objection that was the objection to the question.
Your question with regard to the point in time where the video shows that Mr. Boyd was turning is not objectionable.
Okay, it's the laying on the ground part.
Correct.
Okay, that's what I'm trying to get clear, Judge, because I don't want to go off the rails again this morning. That's why I'm bringing it up this morning. Because I don't want to go off the rails. I'm not trying to do that on purpose. Okay. All right. Thanks, Judge. Here we go. And Judge, okay, the was on, thanks. May I proceed, Your Honor?
Let me just have the witness for his name for the record.
Okay.
Dominic Perez.
May proceed.
Okay. Good morning, Mr. Pettis.
Good morning, ma'am.
Mr. Pettis, I want to start this morning with the roles of the people who were up there with Mr. Boyd. One person, Scott Weimer-Skirch, he had the duty of negotiating with Mr. Boyd and handling the K-9. Is that right, sir?
When I was up there, ma'am,
Yes, sir.
I know him to be handling the canine. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And then another person, that was Rope Officer Rick Ingram, was assigned to handle the taser shotgun. Is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
He had 2 taser shotguns and a rifle slung on him, did he not, sir?
As I understand it now, yes, ma'am.
Okay. And then there were 2 people who were lethal cover. Is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Defendant Keith Sandy, is that right?
At the time, I did not know it was Defendant Keith Sandy. I knew there was another officer up there. I didn't know it was
Okay.
Defendant Sandy.
But you now know it to be Defendant Keith
Yeah,
Sandy,
I
who
do
was doing
know
lethal
now,
cover.
yes,
And
ma'am.
he also had the job of throwing the flashbang in addition to being lethal cover?
Yes, ma'am.
And then there was you, who were also lethal cover, who was coming up from below. Is that right?
That is correct.
And there was no one of the 4 of you who you were aware had been assigned to go hands-on to arrest Mr. Boyd. Is that right?
I didn't have any knowledge of the plan, so I did not know that. No, ma'am.
Yes, sir. You didn't know that any one of those 4 people, yourself included, were assigned to go hands-on on Mr. Boyd?
No, ma'am.
And under the SWAT protocols, what would happen when you were going to effectuate an arrest under Sergeant Fox would be there would be 1 person assigned to go hands-on. Is that right?
The designation of someone to go hands-on, it could be, it doesn't have to be one specific person. I mean, it could be tasked out to one of those persons by whoever's controlling the movement.
All right, but when you go in on an arrest team, there's always somebody assigned, 1 or more persons assigned to be hands-on. Is that right?
The goal is to try and have someone assigned. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And if the trio up there at the inner perimeter had waited until you or Ramon Ornelas arrived with more manpower and the beanbag shotgun, they could have assigned one of the 4 of you to do that. Is that right?
Irrelevance.
SWAT has actually trained together to do arrests like that. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am, we do train together.
Let's talk about your role as the backup, what I'm going to call, for want of a better term, the backup cover officer to Detective Sandy.
Object to the mischaracterization of the evidence that's in evidence, Your Honor. States facts, not in evidence.
In your role as backup cover officer, you were removed somewhat from the action. Is that right, sir?
When I initially came up, yes, ma'am.
You were about 25 feet away from Mr. Boyd. Is that what you said yesterday?
Yes, that is what I said.
Away from what I think in SWAT terms you call the hot zone?
I'm not sure of a hot zone.
Okay, what do you call the inner perimeter? Do you have a term for it?
There's the, I'm not sure, there's the inner perimeter and then there's the outer perimeter. I'm not sure what you're
Okay.
referring to, ma'am.
The idea is that if there's somebody that's a distance away from where the action is happening, that person might be able to see more of what's going on. Is that right, sir?
Yes, further back from whatever the situation is, you can see more, yes, ma'am.
And you were also not under the immediate influence of whatever's happening up there. Is that right, sir?
That's correct.
And the idea is that hopefully you can make a calmer, more reasoned decision. Is that correct?
Being further back, that's the potential, yes.
Okay. Let's talk about what you could see, and this is sort of where we left off yesterday. With the court's permission, Your Honor, I would like to do what we discussed at the bench, that is put on a gray T-shirt and use myself with the photograph as a demonstrative aid.
Let's see what you have.
Okay. All right. So, Judge, I have the photograph, which has been marked as 57X. Should I show the court? It's been marked and submitted, and then there's just this gray T-shirt.
Can you come up and see?
And let me put up what's in marked as states 48D. And yesterday, Officer Perez, you were talking about how you were looking through this area right here between your sights at the beginning, and then you begin to focus here on the red.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I thought we turned this on, but mine's not picking up.
Are you sure it's not on? Or are you sure it's on?
It was on. It's his fault.
You'll have to track the wiring and, you'll have to track the wiring and make sure it's plugged in properly and turned on. My understanding is everyone else's screen is working.
Right, it came on, it looks like, but then it just went blank again. Your Honor, for the time, there we go.
We've plugged in some stuff over here.
Oh, you just pushed.
I just opened something that came on. So now it's Sherry's fault.
Now what?
Now it's Sherry's fault.
I was just kidding. If it doesn't work, Your Honor, I'll scoot around this side for the time.
Sherry, is the wiring underneath it connected?
Okay, it's on.
Looks like it's coming on. I'll figure it out until Your Honor, she can continue.
Okay, ready, Mr. Perez?
Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
So you talked about looking through this area here, and then when you got ready to shoot, you began looking through the red dot scope. Is that right, sir?
That's correct. I looked through the opening in between my sight and the magnifier to look at the officers, and then I came back to the site. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and at that point, you began focusing on the site in relation to the target, which was Mr. Boyd. Is that right?
That's correct. I got a flash sight picture. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and through the red dot scope, you could see Mr. Boyd's gray sweatshirt, could you not, sir?
I could see gray. Yes.
Okay. And, sir, you aimed at center mass,
Yes, ma'am.
and you could also see through your peripheral view the officers in close proximity to Mr. Boyd, could you not, sir?
At the time I fired?
Yes, sir. You talked about looking over here to make sure that you didn't hit these officers over there, is that right?
That's correct. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And through that red dot scope, you can see color, like you could see the gray sweatshirt, could you not, sir?
Can I see color through the sight?
Yes, sir.
Yes, there's color through the sight.
All right. And you're, even though you train others to shoot with both eyes open, you say you squint one eye, is that what you do, sir?
Yes, I have. Well, I don't train others to shoot with both eyes open. I try and adapt them to however they need to shoot, whatever's
Okay.
more comfortable for them.
All right.
And then I do shoot with my left eye squinted.
Okay. And you can, in addition to seeing colors, you can see shapes, can you not, sir?
I'm not sure when.
When you're looking through the red dot side, sir.
When I'm looking to the red dot sight, I'm looking at the aperture, the
Yes, sir.
red dot.
And you're putting it on the person ahead of you, is that right?
I'm putting it on whatever the threat is, or the target, paper target, whatever it is.
And you can see movement,
There is the potential to see movement.
and you can also see lettering sometimes, is that right?
If you're performing proper weapons manipulation and sight picture,
Yes, sir.
you're not going to see letters.
It's going to be fuzzy, isn't it, sir?
That's correct.
All right. But you're going to see fuzzy letters, is that right?
No, you're going to see a fuzzy silhouette.
All right. And you had a light on top of your rifle that lit up Mr. Boyd, did you not, sir?
Yes, there was a light on my rifle. Yes, ma'am.
And you're aware that Mr. Boyd had on the front of his T-shirt the letters that said GAP. Is that right, sir?
No.
Okay. You know now?
As of now, yes, ma'am, I do know.
Okay. And so, if you could see fuzzy letters, shapes, color, movement, when Mr. Boyd was facing you, this is how he would look. About 12 inches wide, maybe a little bit more, maybe he's a little bit more than 12 inches wide when he was facing you. Is that right, sir?
I didn't say I saw fuzzy letters, ma'am. I saw a fuzzy silhouette.
Okay. When you saw the fuzzy silhouette, Mr. Boyd was about 12 inches, 14 inches wide, squared off this way to you. Is that right, sir?
I can't be certain of the dimension.
Okay. When he turned, sir, he would be thinner, would he not? And be 4 to 5 inches wide when he turned to his left. Is that right?
Again, I can't be sure of the dimension, ma'am.
Okay. And then when he turned again, he would again be wide in shape to you. Is that right?
And yes, there would be a wide silhouette, yes, ma'am.
All right. And you should be able to see that through your red dot scope.
The silhouette, ma'am?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I was able to see a silhouette.
And let me make sure, it is your claim that you did not see that he had turned around and his back was to you. Is that what you say, sir?
That's correct.
Okay. If in fact you had seen him turn around and his back was to you at the point you saw him, would that be an imminent threat or not, sir?
Objection, call irrelevance, Your Honor, and calls for speculation.
I'm sorry, can you repeat, ma'am?
Yes, sir. If in fact you saw him turn around and his back was to you at the time, he was no longer an imminent threat to you, was he, when his back was to you?
He was not an imminent threat to me, no, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Perez. Before you fired, you heard somebody else fire, did you not?
Before I fired, no, ma'am. It was while I was firing.
You appreciated that somebody else was firing as well, is that right?
I heard shots when I was deploying my rounds, yes.
Okay. And you recall giving your statement, sir, 2 days afterwards?
Yes, ma'am.
And at that time, you did not say it was at the time you were firing your rounds. You said it was when you were sighting in that you heard the shots. Is that right, sir?
I'd have to review my statement, ma'am.
Okay. Page 60, counsel, line 8 through 12. At that time, Mr. Perez, again, when you'd been given 2 days to think about this, you said, in my recollection, I heard while I was, like I said, transitioning and sighting in on the suspect, about to deploy deadly force, I heard other fires starting to occur while I was pressing my trigger. Is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am. At the same time I'm deploying my rounds, I heard the rounds.
Okay. You know from your military training about the concept of sympathetic fire, do you not, Mr. Perez?
I've heard the term, yes, ma'am.
And that means when one person shoots, it sometimes prompts other soldiers to shoot as well?
That's generally the definition, yes, ma'am.
And you're aware from both your training and the training you give others that that reaction happens on an unconscious level, does it not?
I can't be sure of that. I don't instruct on that.
Okay. And you can't say whether hearing the other shots affected your perceptions or your decisions in this case, can you, sir?
The shots being fired affecting my decision to fire, ma'am?
Yes, sir.
No, that didn't affect my decision.
Okay. Let me talk about the timing of all this. You got the call about 45 minutes before Mr. Boyd was shot at 7:33. Is that right? That he was shot at 7:33. You got the call about 45 minutes before that, the initial call to come out.
Roughly 6:45 p.m., yes, ma'am.
Okay. And you dressed out and were officially dispatched at 7:01?
I'd have to check the CAD again.
Okay.
Somewhere around that time, I went out to my car to log on.
Right. And you arrived at about 11 minutes after 7 o'clock?
About that time, yes, ma'am.
And then you, as I understood your testimony yesterday, you walked out to the scene to check out and see where Mr. Boyd was?
I walked up to the homes and oriented myself, yes, ma'am.
And then came back and contacted Sergeant Fox at the staging area after he arrived at 7:20. Is that right?
I'd have to verify on his arrival time, ma'am. But I did, after I oriented myself, I came back to Sergeant Fox's vehicle and checked in with him.
Okay, so you checked in at his vehicle rather than when he went to the backyard, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And as you drove to the scene, you were reading the CAD to educate yourself on what was going on.
Yes, ma'am.
And about a half hour before the shooting on the CAD, you saw that someone was calling for additional resources with less lethal options and also calling for CIT officers. Did you see that on the CAD, sir?
Yes, I did read that on the CAD.
And you're now aware that in fact there were already beanbag shotguns there at the scene, are you not, sir?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
Okay. And you know now, do you know why they were calling for CIT officers when there were already 2 CIT officers already on the scene?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
Let's talk about what you knew and what you didn't know from the CADs or the radio before going up to the U-Mound. You knew that the initial call was for illegal camping, did you not?
Yes, ma'am.
And were you ever told at any time, either on the CADs or after you arrived there, that Mr. Boyd was claiming that APD had attacked him first before he pulled out his knives?
Objection, relevance.
Goes to his knowledge, Your Honor. Did you know before you went up there that Mr. Boyd had been expressing fear that the police officers were going to kill him?
Objection, relevance.
Sir, you've talked about that you were afraid of Mr. Boyd, and did you have any information about Mr. Boyd and what he had expressed to officers himself?
Objection, relevance.
You did not know anything about, I think we've established the plan by the trio of Sandy, Weimerskirch, and Ingram, is that right?
Objection, relevance, asked and answered.
In your SWAT training, you talked about your experience with flashbang grenades. Had you been consulted about the plan? You too had a flashbang, did you not, sir, with you?
I did.
Objection, relevance.
I did have noise flash diversionary devices.
And you have been trained in its use, have you not, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And you know if you throw it in front of a rock, and the rock is between the person and the flashbang, that will shield the person from the effect of the flashbang, is that right?
That's what can occur when the noise flash diversionary device is deployed. The goal is not to throw it at the rock, it's to put it where you want to put it.
Right, and you would know where to deploy it to have the desired effect, would you not, sir?
I know how to deploy a noise flash diversionary device, yes, ma'am.
And had Mr. Sandy and Officer Weimerskirch waited, you could have utilized your expertise
Objection,
in the
relevance.
flashbang. I think Mr. Robles asked you about your first aid training. APD at the time actually had an SOP that required officers to render medical aid following the use of deadly force. Did it not?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor, and if it continues, we need to approach.
I want to ask you about a precise phrase that you used in describing in your statement why you shot. And I think at the time what you said was, it was at that time, at page 22, counsel.
What's the line?
Let me find it, just one second. Line 8, counsel. It was at that time I decided to use deadly force on the subject to save the lives of those officers who were in close proximity with him. Is that the phrase that you used in your statement, sir?
That sounds about right, ma'am.
And you're aware from your training on what constitutes defense of others, that would match what would be legally required to claim defense of others. Is that right?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
Can you repeat that again? I'm sorry,
Sure.
ma'am.
You know from your training on what is a defense of others, that statement would match the legal defense of claim of others, claim of defense of others. Isn't that right, sir?
It does match, yes, ma'am.
Okay, and you know Defendant Sandy gave a statement just 2 hours after you did.
Objection, relevance.
It will be brave resume. Okay.
I didn't know when Detective Sandy was giving his exact
Okay.
time.
And you heard in the testimony of Jeff Stone that Detective Sandy said something very similar. He said, "I made the decision to use deadly force because of the proximity and the knives that I was going to engage him with my rifle." Did you hear him say that, Detective Stone say that that's what Detective Sandy had said?
I don't recall all of Detective Stone's testimony.
Okay. You recognize that your military experience and the service that you do as a police officer are different?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely.
In the military, you were fighting the enemy? Is that right, sir?
I was fighting,
Relevance, Your Honor.
In the police department, your obligation is to protect and serve citizens, is it not, sir?
absolutely, yes, ma'am.
Okay. 1 second, Charlie. I'll pass the witness, Your Honor.
Yes. Your Honor, could you switch to prosecution? Thank you. Mr. Perez, what I'd like to do is to review some of the questions that were asked by the prosecution in this case, and I'd like to begin in the order in which those questions were raised. You were asked a question about soft point bullets yesterday. Do you remember that?
Yes, sir.
Now, why does the Albuquerque Police Department use soft point bullets?
Well, they issue them especially for, because of officers having to potentially use deadly force. We don't want what's called overpenetration. If you have a threat that you are having to engage of sorts, you don't want an innocent bystander or someone else, maybe another officer, another person, to for that bullet to pass through whatever the threat is and continue on and hurt someone else. So you would want them to stop the action in that threat.
Simply, would you please explain what it is about a soft point bullet that prevents that kind of bullet from penetrating through a human body and possibly striking a bystander?
Well, with those rounds, they are built to start to separate or open up, if you will, to slow down once they hit tissue or a medium of sorts. So it's made to start to break apart and widen, if you will, so that it will slow down and not overpenetrate.
Now, who issued the ammunition that you used in the officer-involved shooting of James Boyd?
The Albuquerque Police Department.
What choice did you have in your selection of ammunition for use as a police officer?
It's not my choice. They choose they do the research and issue out the ammunition that they found is able to be used by law enforcement.
What I'd like to do now is to show Exhibit I-2, which is the reactive control model. You were asked a series of questions by the prosecution about the nature of the threat in the red. Do you remember those questions?
Yes, sir.
And you were asked a question, I believe, that with the statement of, "Bullets travel faster than Boyd can run." Do you remember being asked a question with that phrase?
I remember that, yes, sir.
Would you please explain why that particular phrase, "a bullet travels faster than Mr. Boyd could run," is misleading?
Well, in reference to the armed assailant and moving from armed threatening to armed attack, the variable is distance and the opportunity. So an armed attack can happen within a moment's notice with little or no warning. So if that proximity is really close, you can't wait, an officer can't wait for the attack to begin because you'd be physically unable to stop the attack before it's completed. So in essence, the officer has to deploy deadly force before the attack even begins.
Now, this whole idea that bullets travel faster than people, would you please explain why that doesn't matter in a situation in which a suspect who's armed with an edged weapon, for instance, is in close proximity to another officer?
Well, if the threat is armed with an edged weapon and you're not able to react in time to deploy the rounds to shoot that bullet, then the speed of the bullet doesn't even matter. I mean, if you can't react and come up on target and sight in and deploy the deadly force in time, you're not going to, the speed of the bullet doesn't matter. The attack is already being completed.
Now, you were asked about this whole notion that an armed attack requires a suspect to move. Do you remember that, being asked those questions?
Yes, sir.
Would you please explain why an armed attack can exist without the suspect moving?
Well, again, that all goes back to opportunity and the distance. If someone is standing within a arm's length or has an edged weapon and is able to reach out and deliver that deadly force with that weapon, the motion forward or the step or any of that is not required. The distance has already been closed. The proximity is already there. So the completion of the attack is already started.
If you would put up State's Exhibit 48A. Now, do you recall being asked a series of questions as to whether you saw Mr. Boyd take a step or lunge?
Yes, sir.
Now, would you please use State's Exhibit 48A to explain why your equipment did not allow you to see Mr. Boyd's body? Lower body, I should say. I'm sorry.
No problem. Well, like I said, once I had transitioned my sight from initially when I made the decision to deploy deadly force, and I had transitioned from Mr. Boyd to my front sight, and then I moved from that front sight to make sure that my fellow officers here are not crossing in to my line of fire. When I came back, the movement of Mr. Boyd had already occurred.
Now, we were asked a series of questions in which Ms. McGinn demonstrated by placing a gray sweatshirt on her person and placing a photograph on her sweatshirt to show the movement of Mr. Boyd. What is it about that demonstration that is misleading in terms of what you could have seen and is demonstrated or as shown in 48A when you were out on that mountainside addressing Mr. Boyd?
Well, this is the lighting conditions are different. The stress, the distance is different. There are other factors that I'm having to worry about on this hill at this point. And like going back a little bit to your previous question, my rifle and weapon system is in front of me, so I can't see the lower half of Mr. Boyd. All I see when I'm looking through my sight is the torso of Mr. Boyd.
If I could stop you there.
Yes, sir.
Now, you've been in court when we have shown the video and shown Mr. Boyd's steps.
Yes, sir.
So you know it in fact happened.
Objection leading, Your Honor.
So even though you now know it happened, why is it that you couldn't see it?
At that point when that was occurring, I was not looking at Mr. Boyd's legs. I was not focused on Mr. Boyd's legs. I was focused on looking through my sight and sighting in, obtaining a flash sight picture on Mr. Boyd.
And I interrupted you when you were explaining what it is that happened when Mr. Boyd was turning. If you would you please walk us through the process that you went through once you made the decision to use deadly force, what it is that you did in order to finally have a flash sight picture?
Okay, so initially, when the threat presented itself and Mr. Boyd retrieved his knives and had them out to his sides, it was at that time I decided to deploy deadly force because of the imminent threat to Officer Weimerskirch. Now, like I had said before yesterday, I had to look between this front sight here and my magnifier, excuse me. looking through there with my peripheral because my cheek is already on my weapon system, and I'm looking through my sight, now just moving my sight to my officers over here to my right to make sure that they're not crossing into my line of fire. Right after I did that, and this is within a split second, I came right back to my sight with no assumption that Mr. Boyd should have changed in any way his location, found the gray that was in my sight, and imposed my red dot on that silhouette and deployed my rounds all at the same time.
Now, the term flash sight picture has been used by you, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Please explain to the jury what it is that what a flash sight picture is.
Well, like when you obtain just a sight picture, you are transitioning from the threat, the target, whatever it is that you're going to be aiming at, from that to the front sight or the sight that's inside of your optic, and then imposing that on the target, and then performing the follow-through of deploying your rounds while keeping the fuzzy silhouette, and the dot centered, trying to maintain that while the weapon system is working. That all occurs in a flashlight picture, that all occurs at the exact same time. So you impose it on the target, you're moving your finger, or excuse me, you're depressing your rounds and performing the follow-through on the target all at the same time.
So what does a flash sight picture look like?
It's everything that you do when you're doing the standard sight picture, but in the training we do is like a second exposure. So on a paper target, it will be facing to the side, and the target will literally be like a clap of a hands or a blink of an eye. It'll turn, present itself, and then turn away. So that's a flash sight picture. If I were to hold my hand edged like this at you and then go like that, that presentation is a flash sight picture.
Now, what is and again, from your point of view, how would you describe what it looks like to focus on the aiming reticle instead of the target behind it? What does that look like?
Well, like when you're using iron sights, you're supposed to focus on the front sight so that you have sighted and accurate fire. With the aiming reticle in the aim point that I have, it's the red burst or the red dot that's in the center of the glass. That takes the place of the front sight post. So you are using your dominant eye, your shooting eye, to focus completely on that. And since you're focusing on something close, I mean, your eye can't focus on two different planes at one time. If there's something close to you, your focus will go to that, and everything beyond that will be fuzzy. So when the dot is imposed on the silhouette or the target, the threat, you are just going to see the fuzzy silhouette. That's all you're going to see, and a crisp red dot.
Now, during yesterday's cross-examination, you were asked a series of questions about justifiable homicide. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
You were asked about your training regarding the state statute that allows for justifiable homicide by a public officer or a public employee. Do you remember those questions?
Yes, sir, I do.
I'd like to ask you about that particular statute and how it applies to this case. At the time of the James Boyd officer-involved shooting, in what capacity were you serving?
I was serving as an Albuquerque Police Department officer.
When you responded to the James Boyd standoff and when you used deadly force against him, were you on duty or off duty?
I was on duty.
Now, based on your training, is homicide by a law enforcement officer justified when the homicide is committed while overcoming actual resistance to the execution of some legal process or to the discharge of any other legal duty?
Objection, pleading and ultimate issue, Your Honor.
Those were questions that were During the time leading up to and including the James Boyd officer-involved shooting, what legal process or duty were you attempting to complete or execute?
We were attempting to arrest Mr. Boyd.
Now, what do you say in response to the questions that Ms. McGinn was asking you about the fact that Mr. Boyd was never told he was under arrest?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, sir?
You recall being asked by Ms. McGinn yesterday that Mr. Boyd was never told he was under arrest.
Yes.
Based on your training and experience, what does an officer have to say to a suspect before they're arrested?
Well, the officer does not have to tell the suspect that they're being arrested. The fact that they can't leave, that means that they're under arrest.
Okay. In your career, how many times have you told a suspect that they were under arrest before they were actually arrested?
I can't even recall ever saying that.
Okay.
Actually telling someone you're under arrest.
Okay, why is that?
When I'm taking them into custody and placing the handcuffs on them, or the flex cuffs that we have on the SWAT team, they know they're being arrested just by them not being able to leave.
Now, based on your training, is homicide by a law enforcement officer justified when an officer has probable cause to believe he or another is threatened with serious physical harm while performing lawful duties?
Objection, Your Honor. Same objection as before, leaving and instructing on law.
Based on your training, what did you learn about the standard for justifiable homicide by a law enforcement officer as to the level of threat which a suspect had to pose before you used deadly force?
The suspect has to pose an immediate deadly threat of serious bodily harm to myself or another officer or citizen. Excuse me.
Where did you first learn that?
In the academy.
Okay. And do you remember in whose class you learned it?
I'm sorry, sir, I can't remember.
Okay. But it's fair to say that that's not something you learned in the days before you gave your statement to Detective Jeffstone.
Objection,
No.
leaving, Your Honor.
No, sir.
Please explain why you believe that James Boyd threatened Officer Weimer-Skirch with serious physical harm or deadly force while Officer Weimer-Skirch was performing his lawful duties.
I believe James Boyd posed an immediate deadly threat by his intent, his means, and his opportunity. The intent was already stated several times, that he wanted to kill officers. He had the means, the knives, and pulled them out when he was clearly given commands to get down on the ground. And then the opportunity presented itself when he drew his knives and the distance was closed by Officer Weimer-Skirch. He was an immediate deadly threat.
Turning to another topic, and I believe that topic was discussed yesterday and today, and that's the topic of surrender. Now, you were asked a series of questions about that by Ms. McGinn. Do you remember those questions?
Yes, sir.
Would you please explain why you believe that Mr. Boyd was not surrendering to your commands to get on the ground?
Well, as you can tell from the video, I gave several commands for him to get on the ground. In the initial commands for him to get on the ground, there was less lethal tools being deployed, yes. But in the event that those tools are being deployed and I'm giving commands for Mr. Boyd to get on the ground, he had time to react to those commands, and instead he chose to react by drawing his knives rather than get on the ground. So he did have time to react and follow those commands.
So when Ms. McGinn, do you remember Ms. McGinn asking you a question about the reactionary gap as applied to Mr. Boyd?
Yes, sir.
Now that also had to do with surrender. Do you remember those questions?
Yes, sir.
Now, would you please explain why the idea of the reactionary gap does not explain the state's contention that Mr. Boyd was in fact surrendering?
Well, like I was just describing, the fact that Mr. Boyd chose to retrieve knives as opposed to follow the command of get down on the ground, there was the time for him to retrieve the knives and to make the decision to retrieve the knives rather than make the decision to get down on the ground.
You were asked today questions about sympathetic fire. Do you remember those questions?
Yes, sir.
Would you please explain why your decision to use deadly force was not a result of sympathetic fire?
Well, like I was saying, my job is to be a cover officer, and at that point, all I'm concerned with is all the officers that are there with me at the location. I'm not paying attention specifically to other lethal cover officers. So as a cover officer, I feel my responsibility is to cover all of them, every officer. So taking that job to that level of seriousness, I'm focused intently on what the actions are of the person I'm dealing with and keeping my officers in my peripheral. So the job of being a cover officer and actually focusing in on what I need to do as far as deal with that situation and cover those officers, that's paramount in my mind.
You were also asked questions about your statement, specifically page 22. And you recall being asked about a statement you made where you said, because it was at that time, I decided to use deadly force on the suspect to save the lives of those officers who were in close proximity to him. Do you remember being asked questions about that statement made by you?
Yes, sir.
Now, why did you make that statement? Because it was at that time I decided to use deadly force on the suspect to save the lives of those officers who were in close proximity to him in your interview with Detective Stone.
I was describing at that time what the actions were, or what the scene looked like to me in my mind of where Mr. Boyd was and where my officers were at and what Mr. Boyd was doing at that time. So in describing before that part of the statement that his arms were out and he was in this aggressive fighting stance, he had the knives and he was poised to strike, that's when I state it was at that time that I decided to use deadly force.
May I take a moment to confer, Your Honor? Those are my questions.
Good morning.
Morning, sir.
When you decided to shoot, did you know whether Keith Sandy had also decided to shoot?
No, sir.
Okay. When you fired your first shot, did you realize Keith had just fired a shot?
No, sir. I was focused on deploying my rounds.
Was your decision or action to shoot influenced in any way by what Keith Sandy was doing?
No, sir.
Those are all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perez. May I have a seat, please?
Yes, ma'am.
How's the jury doing? Do you need a stretch break before we proceed, or are you okay? Okay? Mr. Greco?
Can we approach her?
Officer Perez address.
My understanding is the next witness will be Scott.
That's correct, Your Honor.
So let's take